Hey everybody, welcome to my tutorial on the Oreo chocolate drip cake. So after I baked the cakes, allowed them to cool, and then cut off the tops in order to make sure that they were flat, I started by placing my first layer on my cake tray, followed by a thin layer of Oreo buttercream. I then made sure that it was nice and flat before I added the second layer of cake. Once I put the second layer of cake on, I added another layer of icing on top of it and around the sides. I filled in some of the gaps to make sure that the cake was level before I added the third layer, because if your second layer isn't level, when you add your third layer, the whole cake is going to become crooked, and that's not good especially for a drip cake. So I then added a layer of icing on top before I put on my third layer of the cake. You don't have to put much icing between the layers, or you can put a lot. It all depends on personal preference if you're really into icing or not. So then once I put on the top layer of cake, I made sure it was centered and then did a crumb coat around the entire outside of the cake. As I've said in other posts, crumb coats are really important because they trap all of the cake crumbs inside, so before you add your outer layer, to make sure that you don't see any. But since this is an Oreo cake, there is little crumbs in it, so it doesn't matter if you do a crumb coat or not, but I just like to do one anyways. I then placed the cake in the freezer for an hour in order to let the crumb coat set. It's really important to let the crumb coat set because otherwise you're just adding more icing and it's just all going to smush together and you're not going to have a very strong structure. So I then took the remaining icing that I had and I did a second layer of icing over my crumb coat. You don't have to be very particular with this, but I am kind of a perfectionist, so I took a little while to do this to make sure that there were no empty spots where there wasn't icing, or that the icing was uneven, or that there was any marks in it. You can definitely do a sloppier version if you want, and if you kind of like want that rustic looking cake, but especially with a drip cake, you want a smooth surface to start your drips in the first place, because that makes the rest of the process a whole lot easier. So after doing this for a while and making sure my cake was nice and even, I started with my chocolate drip. After melting my chocolate in the microwave, then adding a few teaspoons of olive oil, I then placed it in a piping bag and cut a small hole for a tip. I then started around the outside of the cake, squeezing very carefully as I worked my way. You don't have to squeeze very hard because of the consistency of the chocolate, and you can squeeze a little harder in some spots to make the drips go down further and then not as far, because I really like the varied lengths of the drips. I think it adds a lot to the cake. After I finished my drips, I then took the remaining chocolate I had and spread it on top of the cake just to make a thin layer before I put the rest of the toppings on. If you're not a huge fan of dark chocolate, which I know a lot of people aren't, you don't have to add this top layer. Or you can use milk chocolate or any other type of chocolate if you like. The recipe just said dark chocolate, so I tried to stick with that. And I then smoothed out the top layer of the chocolate and then sprinkled on my Oreo bits, which I just made by putting in a Ziploc bag and smashing with a rolling pin. I then placed the cake back in the fridge for 15 minutes just to let that chocolate layer set, and I was good to go with my final decorations. I took a star tip in a piping bag and used the rest of my icing to create a swirled pattern around the outside of the cake. This is a really easy design to do because all you have to do is create little spirals, and really you can do whatever kind of design you want around the outside. It's all up to you. I then added whole Oreo cookies to the outside layer of the cake. I did as many as there was in the picture of the cake that I found online, but if you're not a huge fan of having full-sized Oreos on your cake, then you can definitely do fewer, or you don't have to do it at all if you think it looks okay before that. But I was just going for the finished product. And there you have it. This is the final picture of my cake, which I'm quite pleased with. I think it turned out quite well. And of course I had to take a piece out of it just to show you what it looks like. So I picked a very small piece because I knew this cake was going to be rich because of all the chocolate. But yeah, you can see the nice even layers. It's very, very good. So thank you so much for listening and watching this video. And I hope you check in next week to see what I have to make. See you.